Hello and welcome to Eye on Africa here on France 24. I'm Fraser Jackson. Here are the stories making headlines across the continent this evening. After a month of fighting, the head of Sudan's military formally fires his deputy and former ally. The warring pair have unleashed deadly violence on Sudan, which has killed hundreds and threatens to devolve into an all-out civil war. On the neighbouring Central African Republic, the country remembers the people who were abused and worse during the civil wars and political instability over the last 60 years. It's the 8th year the country has officially marked the occasion. And with 180 million gamers and counting, Western video game publishers are missing out on an untapped African market. We'll talk to an expert who tells us just how much potential there is in Africa's gaming industry. It's good to have you with us. Well, it was a symbolic gesture, but given the month of fierce fighting, few were surprised. Sudan's top army general officially fired his deputy, better known as the man leading the paramilitary, which has clashed with government forces since April the 15th. The fighting between soldiers loyal to Sudan's General Burhan and General Dagalo's RSF troops has killed almost 1,000 people and reignited a humanitarian crisis in the country, with millions displaced. Both sides are engaged in Saudi-mediated truce talks, but little progress has been made. On Friday, the head of the Arab League called for peace.
Civilians are paying a huge price for the armed confrontation that some have imposed on Sudan. The time has come for these confrontations to stop and for the parties to commit themselves to the principle of dialogue in order to preserve the blood of the people and to preserve Sudan, its capabilities, its territorial integrity, and the integrity of national institutions. I call for the Jeddah summit to be a starting point for activating an Arab solution that will stop the bloodshed.
For the last week, the Central African Republic has been commemorating the men, women and children who were victims of abuse during the 60 years of political crises and civil wars. As Olivia Bizot and our team on the ground tell us, this is the 8th year the occasion has been marked across the country.
There's an atmosphere of mourning in Bangui, with feelings of pain resurfacing for many victims. Nadej lives in the capital's Yasinda district. Every year, as this week approaches, she becomes haunted by nightmares.
They killed my husband and my 2 daughters. They took everything we had in the house. I was saved because that night I was visiting my parents. Since then, my life has become dark. Thanks to the word of God, I try to forget this misadventure. Even if nothing is the same, my hope is based on justice.
Justice is a word on everyone's lips. Every day, a growing number of victims come here to receive help from the network of Central African psychologists.
In our health center, we receive no less than 50 victims a day. For example, we have an exercise called the Lifeline, which is an exercise that allows a therapist to choose the approach he wants to be able to identify the breach in order to propose a healing solution.
The Special Criminal Court launched its first trial on October the 31st, 2022, 4 years after its establishment. It's become a ray of hope for victims.
There are 32 people held by the Special Criminal Court. As part of this procedure, there are 3 people who are already tried in the first instance, that is to say by the judges of the Assize section. And the hearings in this context resume on May 29th.
The Special Criminal Court will conduct more trials this year. Meanwhile, the Truth, Justice, Reparation and Reconciliation Commission, created in 2020, will continue its work.
Around 20 people have been killed by jihadist attacks in Burkina Faso in recent days. Villages have been raided by armed men shooting indiscriminately and stealing cattle. Burkina Faso has been struggling to get a handle on growing Islamist violence across the country, with many people choosing to flee to neighbouring countries to escape the danger. Well, staying in Burkina Faso, an Australian man held captive by extremists has been reunited with his wife after 7 years in captivity. 88-year-old Kenneth Elliott was taken back in 2016 along with his wife. However, she was freed after 3 weeks. The pair had been running a medical clinic in the country for 4 decades when they were kidnapped. The Australian government said no ransom had been paid for his release, but didn't offer more details. Ghana is set to receive the first chunk of money under a new bailout program from the International Monetary Fund. The oil-rich country was forced to return to the IMF program for support last July after its economy tanked, pushing inflation figures to a 3-decade high of over 54% in March. France 24's correspondent Justice Baidu has more from Accra.
This is the 17th time since independence that Ghana is opting for an IMF program. It comes only 4 years after it exited its last one.
Ghanaians have been waiting impatiently for this new bailout, as they've been feeling the pinch for close to a year since inflation figures started skyrocketing, hitting a 3-decade record high at the beginning of this year. Middle-aged Nene Odum has seen her weekly grocery shopping budget double in the last 6 months alone.
I used to buy Gary 15, now it's 25. In some places 28. That's how serious it is. And you know, when you also have little kids at home, Indomie is like a staple thing. It has to be in the home. Now, the Indomie is like a rich man's food. Don't even talk about rice.
I hope the government will spend this IMF money on the agricultural sector so that we can produce more food to bring the prices down.
The 3-year IMF program has already forced the government to renegotiate its debt with creditors. The country's debt currently stands around $600 billion. Analysts blame the debt situation on irresponsible borrowing by the government. But the government has consistently blamed the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the COVID-19 pandemic for how badly the economy has done over the last 2 years.
And finally, from Hogwarts Legacy to Zelda, 2023 has seen the release of some huge games. Well, the gaming industry is now bigger than the movie and music business combined. Now, Africa's slice of that pie might be small, but it's growing. There are some 180 million gamers in sub-Saharan Africa, and thanks to increased access to mobile phones, that number is likely to explode in the years to come. Let's talk to someone who is well positioned to discuss the future of the African gaming industry with me. Nick Hall is the founding member and former chair of Makes Games South Africa, the country's largest online community for game developers. He joins me now live from Cape Town. Nick, thank you so much for speaking to us here on France 24 this evening. Now, Nick, the gaming industry has long been dominated by American, European, even Japanese studios. How do you see that changing over the next few years?
Well, I think the big thing that's happening is that there's become the model of game distribution has changed somewhat, and that's become very beneficial for African developers specifically. We're moving to kind of games as a service as the preliminary model, and that means that the platform holders and the distributors are always looking for new and fresh content. And that is something that African developers specifically are very well positioned to supply, especially since very few people know about African games. They don't really know African folklore or other stories that could come from the continent. So I'm hoping that in the next few years we'll see a dramatic change in terms of where the sort of popular games, the AAA titles, your major franchises, will start seeing more local content from Africa kind of being present in those titles.
Of course, though, a lot goes into making a video game, doesn't it? You need coders, devs, as developers, for people who don't know at home, and much more as well. Is there an untapped pool of this talent in Africa, or are they being brain drained by these big studios elsewhere?
Yeah. So yes, look, there is a large pool of talent. And I think one of the things that's very interesting is that, as you've mentioned, game development is so multidisciplinary. It requires coders, it requires artists, musicians, sound designers, software engineers. And so all of those individual disciplines have already schools and education programs and existing jobs in other industries. And what game development or the gaming industry offers is an opportunity for all these skills to kind of come together. So there certainly isn't a lack of talent in Africa. As you mentioned, those that have wanted to go into game development specifically have found that they've needed to go and seek opportunities off of the continent. But that is starting to slowly change. We're seeing an increase of the number of studios that are becoming commercially viable, that are becoming commercially successful, and with that means that there are more jobs and more job opportunities.
Rockstar Games, who, if people don't know, is one of the biggest publishers in the world. They're responsible for the Grand Theft Auto series, Red Dead Redemption. They've opened offices in unusual places, a couple of places in the UK, but they also opened a branch in India. Is that a kind of model that you would like to see replicated in Africa, where foreign publishers open an office on the continent, or would you like to see more homegrown talent creating big title releases?
Oh, that is a very good question. Ultimately, yes, I think we would like to see a large studio or a large publisher make moves into African soil. But before that can happen, we need to ensure that the local ecosystem is able to sustain it. There have been instances where this has happened before, where it was premature and it ended up decimating the local ecosystem. So first, we need to make sure that the local ecosystem is well developed, that we have our own mid-tier AA, triple-I kind of studios in place, and then we will be well positioned to receive one of these larger studios, which can then have an amplifying effect. But we need to do the groundwork first to make sure that we're ready to receive them.
Would you, just briefly if you would you like to see more African representation in video games then? And if so, would that have to happen from one of the biggest studios to get people almost kind of welcomed into this different genre of African games?
Absolutely, I would like to see better African representation. We tend to be either a venue for sports or a place where non-Africans are fighting over African kind of resources. And that's about it. There's very little positive representation of Africa in games. Does that require a AAA studio to do it? Maybe, but I would hope then that if they did decide to do that, that they would then use local indigenous resources to make sure that they're giving an authentic product. There's a lot of exciting games coming out of Africa, though, that I think will be first. And with the rise of indie gaming becoming more prevalent, I don't think it necessarily needs to be a large AAA title for it to kind of reach sort of the popular consumer audience. I think a smaller local studio could do that.
Nick, I'm a gamer myself. I could stay and talk to you all day, but we've got to leave it there. Nick Hall, thank you so much for joining us there live from Cape Town. Well, that's all we've got. Thank you. That's all we've got time for this edition of Eye on Africa, but stay tuned. There's more news coming up next on France 24.